morning, everyone, and welcome to our first Capstone Defense of the 2026 Capstone Defense season. My name is Dr. Alex Sévigny. I'm a professor in the Department of Communication Studies and Multimedia and in the Master of Communications Management program, and I will be chairing today's session. I'm pleased to welcome our Capstone Defender, Marilena Rotundo, and her supervisor, Professor David Scholz, as well as her second reader and committee member, Professor Martin Waxman. A few rules of the road before we get started. Marilena will have 25 minutes to present, at the end of which there'll be a question period of roughly 15 to 20 minutes, depending on timing. And then after the question period, the thesis committee I will put everyone into a room, or we'll find a way of sequestering the thesis committee, and we will deliberate for a few minutes and come back with the verdict. And then that will end the session just before 10 a.m. So I want to say that during the way the question period is going to run is we have a first question from the Capstone supervisor, Professor Scholz, followed by a question from Professor Waxman. And then after that, I have the opportunity to ask a question as chair of the session, should I wish to. We then go through a second round of questions in the same order from the committee. And then we open questions up to the floor. So anybody in the gallery, attendees, family members, fellow classmates are welcome to make a comment, make a suggestion, or ask a question to our Capstone Defender. At the end of that gallery round of questions, the committee will go into deliberation, as I mentioned. Okay, it's 9:02. We'll pretend it's 9:03. So Marilena, you have until 9:28, or say roughly 9:30, depending on timing, to present. So the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex. Good morning, everyone. I appreciate all of you being here for my capstone defense so early on a Friday morning. I'm really looking forward to sharing my findings with you all about the growing space of podcasts and how they are becoming a real force in the Canadian media landscape. So just a quick overview of what we will be discussing today. I will be starting by setting the stage and explaining the background on podcasts, as well as the research concepts captured in my literature review. I will then move on to the research process, including my hypothesis, research questions, and methodology, and then we'll jump into the actual findings and examine key takeaways from this project. Over the past 2 decades, digital media has fundamentally reshaped how people communicate and access information. As content has moved online and connectivity has become ever-present, information sharing has become faster, more global, and less constrained by traditional media structures. Within this evolving digital ecosystem, podcasts have emerged as a particularly influential format. Originating in the early 2000s as an on-demand evolution of radio, podcasting has grown into a global multi-billion-dollar industry and an increasingly common way for audiences to engage with news and current affairs. The term itself was actually coined by Ben Hammersley, and it combines iPod and broadcasting to reflect its origins in the era of portable digital media. As podcasts offer more personalized and diversified news experiences, they also raise important questions about trust, influence, and how Canadians interpret current events. In my literature review, I focused on how mass media influence works today and how podcasts have evolved into what I call a hybrid source of media. They still have a one-to-many reach of traditional broadcasting, but they also have the on-demand niche and participatory features that we typically associate with digital platforms. I found that podcasts are especially appealing to younger generations. Over 90 million Americans listen to podcasts each month, and 52% of those listeners are under the age of 35. I also looked at how podcasts are being normalized through current events. The 2024 US election is a good example, where both parties used podcasts as part of their campaign strategies. In Canada, podcasts have been much less present in federal campaigning, and my results suggest that this might be a missed opportunity. From there, I used a few key theories to frame what's happening. Diffusion of innovations helps explain how new media formats get adopted and become normalized. And agenda setting theory helps us to understand how media shapes what issues people are paying attention to. I also brought in a trust and misinformation lens from psychology because the same accessibility that makes podcasts so diverse can also create risk when claims are not well sourced or verified. And finally, I use the media richness theory, which is basically about how well a medium can communicate complex or nuanced information, which helps explain why podcasts can feel so convincing and so engaging to audiences. Okay, now we can get right into the research problem at hand. So, my research question was, how and to what extent have the rise of podcasts influenced the way Canadians consume and interpret current affairs? My research question set out to find the following. One, if podcasts were replacing traditional media sources among Canadians. Two, if these podcasts are influencing public opinion. And lastly, if podcasts are actually a trustworthy source of news. Through a triangulated approach, I implemented a literature review of the concepts that I previously discussed and an online survey of Canadians ages 18 and up who listen to podcasts at least once per month, and this garnered 122 responses. Lastly, I also used a content analysis of 5 of the top Canadian news podcasts in Canada. So the content analysis was a bit more complex than the other research methods, so I wanted to provide a bit more color on this method specifically. So I looked at 5 podcasts at 4 points in time for a total of 20 episodes analyzed. The events I examined were from 2022 to 2025, and these included Queen Elizabeth II's death, the Canadian wildfire crisis, the TikTok ban, and the most recent federal election results in Canada. And the podcasts, which were sourced from Apple Podcasts Canadian current affairs charts that I selected, were Front Burner and The Big Story. Both of these are associated with large media companies. The Alex Pearson Show, which is a radio show reproduced as a podcast, and Canada Land and the Hub Dialogues, which both operate independently. And media affiliation is quite important for the results section, so I just wanted to call that out here. To analyze each episode, I used a 4-step process and the support of AI, specifically ChatGPT. All episodes were downloaded, including their transcripts, and then using a prompt that I developed to code each episode's transcript, the AI tool was able to produce an analysis of how each episode performed. To ensure reliability was baked into this process, I also manually coded the first 3 episodes and then retrained the AI for any mistakes or misses within the code. These were actually quite minimal, which highlighted its ability to identify what the code was prompting it for. And while there were 40 units of analysis used, for the purposes of today's presentation and to keep this relatively high level, I'm going to focus on the misinformation risks and the credibility cues that were coded within ChatGPT. So I chose credibility cues, which are verifiable signals in a message that indicate trustworthiness, and these align with the main things that people look for when deciding if something feels accurate online. And then I chose misinformation risk factors, which are factors that increase the chance that information is misleading. Both of these were selected based on what research has already documented. When looking at credibility, I used a more signals equals more credible approach. So each time an episode showed a clear credibility cue, like naming a source, giving context, or correcting something, it earned a point. Those points were then added up, and I grouped the totals into simple bands, high, medium, or low. I did the same thing for misinformation risk, but instead of credibility cues, I counted warning signs. So these are things like vague sourcing, overconfident claims, or one-sided framing. Again, the more warning signs means the higher risk, and I grouped these totals into low, medium, or high, so it was very easy to interpret. And then I looked at both together, and this will all make sense once I move to the next slide, but just wanted to give some background. So basically, crossing these dimensions created what I have coined the Credibility-Misinformation Alignment Index, or the CMA Index. It yielded 5 labels: strong, reliable, generally reliable, mixed, questionable, and unreliable. These labels provided a consistent barometer for comparing episodes that display strong credibility cues, but also carry varying degrees of misinformation risk. Okay, so now that the context has been set, we can dive into the fun part. What exactly did my results show? For my first research question, the survey gave a clear signal that podcasts are starting to bypass some of the more traditional news sources that people typically rely on. Nearly half of respondents said that at least half of their news now comes from podcasts, which is a meaningful shift. And when I asked whether podcasts have reduced their use of other news sources, 41% said yes. I want to emphasize that those who said that traditional media use is not reducing because of podcasts is actually a positive outcome. It doesn't mean they're not listening to podcasts at all. It just means that they are diversifying their media palettes, which is a very important finding throughout this presentation. For the 41% who said that podcasts have reduced their use of other news sources, I also asked a follow-up question. Why choose podcasts over everything else? The top reasons were that podcasts feel less biased, they go more in depth, and they're simply more convenient to fit into daily life. But what stood out the most were the open-ended responses, where people explained it in their own words. A few clear themes came through. One is that podcasts give deeper analysis and often bring in multiple perspectives. Two is that many people see them as a complement, not a full replacement of their media sources. Three is that some feel that they can get their information faster because it is a digital format. And lastly, and most notably, some listeners said that podcasts cover stories, events, or documents that mainstream outlets either miss or do not cover thoroughly enough. Research question 2 was answered using both the survey and the content analysis. To understand framing effects and whether podcasts actually influence opinions, I asked survey participants if they've ever changed their view on a political or social issue after listening to a podcast episode, and a clear majority, 68%, said yes. When I asked why, the top reasons were they heard new information or facts that they had not encountered before. The way the issue was framed made them see it a little bit differently, and guest interviews added context or credibility that influenced how they interpreted the topic. In the content analysis, I coded balanced perspectives as one of the credibility cues. This is basically whether an episode includes more than one side or meaningfully engages opposing views. When I compared that to the CMA index results, a clear pattern showed up. Episodes with more balanced perspectives tended to land in the strong, reliable category, meaning higher credibility and lower misinformation risk. I also used topic as a comparator, and it reinforced the same point. Topics that prompted more balance generally produced stronger CMA ratings. A good example is the Queen Elizabeth II episodes. They had less balance and leaned more into speculation, so that reduced the credibility cues, lowered the episode scores, and ultimately push them into a weaker CMA rating. Another pattern that came through is that media affiliation seems to shape tone. Overall sentiment was closely tied to whether a show was part of a major network, an independent, or a radio program. The network podcasts were the most consistent. They stayed relatively neutral from episode to episode. Independent podcasts were much more volatile. They had bigger swings in tone and generally felt freer to take stronger positions. And the Alex Pearson show, which is the only radio show in my sample, stood out the most. Its sentiment was most notably polarizing compared to how all the other podcasts were tracking when it comes to sentiment. Moving into the last research question, I looked at trustworthiness. The survey showed that news podcasts were the only format where no respondent said that they trust them slightly or not at all. By contrast, social media accounts ranked as the least trustworthy source, with more than half of respondents selecting slightly when asked about their level of trust. In the content analysis, I also calculated a trust score. This was a simple net score, credibility cues minus misinformation risk factors. That gives each episode a score from -10 to +10. The higher the score, the more the episode showed clear, verifiable credibility signals compared to risk indicators. What I saw is that trust varied by both topic and media affiliation. More fact-based episodes and network podcasts tended to score the highest, while more value-laden topics and the radio show tended to score the lowest. Trust was always the strongest when episodes delivered depth, a predictable structure, and meaningful audience interaction, which leads me into my next finding. Episodes with some form of two-way communication had higher trust scores overall. So I coded two-way communication as things like listener call-ins, emails read on air, questions pulled from social media, Q&A segments, live audience interaction, or polls. And that lines up with media richness theory, which is that richer, more interactive communication can improve understanding and reduce uncertainty, thus improving trust. So, what does all of this mean? I've learned 5 main things that I'd like to discuss further in depth. One of the clearest themes is that there's a generational shift in how people are consuming news. Over half of Canadians ages 18 to 34 are monthly podcast listeners. And we even saw that major political campaigns are now using podcasts to reach younger voters because they know that that's where younger audiences already are, and they're meeting them there. What's especially interesting is that compared to social media, podcasts are seen as more trustworthy. This matters in a world dominated by short form content because podcasts can encourage slower, more deliberate thinking, which is more time for context, sourcing, and explanation, not just a 30-second clip. At the same time, podcasts are extremely influential. 68% of respondents said that a podcast episode has changed their view on a political or social issue. This influence can be positive, but it also means that listeners have to be very intentional, seeking out shows with guests, counter arguments, and clear references so they're not just absorbing one host's worldview and using that as their own. A second theme is that misinformation risk in Canadian news podcasts is real, but it isn't uniform. It depends heavily on the topic and how the episode is framed. Across my sample, fact-based episodes that reported settled information, like the election results, tended to show low misinformation risk because there's less room for interpretation. In contrast, episodes built around speculation or a single dominant viewpoint showed higher risk. The Queen Elizabeth II topic is a good example. Much of the discussion focused on the future of the monarchy and Canada's relationship to the crown, issues that are more value-laden and much harder to verify. Those episodes often relied more on opinion and anecdotes and included fewer counter-arguments, which triggered more risk indicators in the coding. Media affiliation also mattered. In this dataset, network podcasts had the most stable, higher trust scores. Independent shows varied more by topic, and the radio program ranked the lowest. But across all types, the biggest risk showed up when episodes lacked balanced perspectives. Another theme is that framing really depends on media affiliation. When an episode shifts from straight reporting into commentary or speculation, the tone tends to become much more negative. In my sample, network podcasts stayed the most neutral across topics. Independent shows swung more depending on the issue, and the radio program leaned more negative. This pattern really makes sense when you look at incentives behind each of these podcasts. Networks typically have editors, standards, and legal review, which tends to filter out extreme claims and stabilize tone. Independent shows often revolve around the host's identity and what their audience expects from them, so the framing can shift a bit more dramatically. And live radio prioritizes speed and debate, which can lead to sharper takes and fewer counterarguments. From a CMA perspective, this matters because tone and credibility do not always move together. An episode can still include credibility cues, but as counterarguments and sourcing thin out, misinformation can quietly increase. So what I'm seeing is an association, not a causation, between more negative framing and slightly higher average misinformation risk. Another key takeaway is that rising trust is positioning podcasts as a more serious news source. In earlier research from 2022, trust in podcasts was still relatively low. But in my survey, no one described news podcasts as untrustworthy. That gap suggests that perceptions of the medium have shifted in just a few short years, and podcasts are now sitting in a more credible place in the media mix. One way to explain this is the diffusion of innovations. Adoption grows when people see a clear advantage. In my survey, the features tied to trust were things like depth, convenience, commute-friendly listening, clear structure, and the ability to easily sample or stop an episode without much effort. Those benefits make it much easier for people to adopt podcasts as a regular habit. Media richness theory also helps explain this. Even though audio isn't traditionally seen as a rich medium, podcasts can still feel richer when they build in interaction and feedback like Q&As, call-ins, social prompts, or polls. In my sample, episodes with two-way elements tended to score higher on trust, which fits with the idea that richer communication can reduce uncertainty and improve understanding. The last theme is that podcasts are acting like shapeshifters in the news ecosystem. They often mirror public conversation when a topic is already trending, but they also have the power to steer attention by choosing which facts to emphasize and whose voices to include. In my study, that showed up very clearly. Every major show in the sample covered each major event that I selected, which signals how quickly podcasts can cluster around these high salience topics. When multiple shows converge on the same issue, it sends a cue to audiences that says, hey, this is important, and it can pull more listeners into a shared frame of interpretation. Now, this can be good or bad, but it's really where agenda setting theory fits in. Media doesn't just reflect what people are talking about, it also helps to shape what people will focus on next. So, where does that leave us? Podcasts sit between traditional and digital media. They deliver news in an audio format, but it can spread online instantly. That opens the door to more voices, but it also means that there's weaker sourcing and uneven credibility that we have to be aware of. Based on that shift, I wanted to end with practical takeaways for 4 key groups: communicators, the public, podcasters, and researchers. For professional communicators, the key point is that podcasts should be treated as a core channel and not just a passing trend, because they're here to stay. Before you pitch, book, or cite a show, apply the CMA index and prioritize programs that rate as strong, reliable, or generally reliable, instead of just choosing based on popularity alone. This matters even more with younger audiences who are actively using podcasts and responding to this longer form conversational depth. CMA vetted podcasts can help to build understanding and not just generate a headline. For the general public, podcasts are now a real part of the Canadian news ecosystem, and they've brought more voices into the conversation. The goal isn't to stop listening, it's just to listen more intentionally. A simple habit is to use the CMA checklist as a quick screen for credibility and risk. And the other key habit is to diversify. Try not to rely on one podcast for all of your news. When a story has real consequences, like an election, a policy change, or a health advisory, listen to a couple of episodes from different types of shows and compare how they frame the issue. For academic researchers, podcasts are a medium worth continued systematic study as their influence grows. A key next step is to validate the CMA index and apply the index across different genres, topics, and countries to see how format, affiliation, and cultural context shape credibility and misinformation risk. And finally, publish code books, decision rules, and scoring scripts so the CMA can be replicated and improved over time. That's what will help the field distinguish what is trustworthy, where risk is higher, and where uncertainty still remains. So that way, future guidance to practitioners and platforms and the public is completely evidence-based. For podcasters, the goal isn't just attention, it should be on building a track record that audiences can trust. Treat each episode like reported work. Bring in qualified guests, clearly identify their credentials, and ground claims in documents, data, and verifiable sources. Structure matters too. A predictable format that includes counter arguments, clarifications, and follow-up questions helps to prevent one-sided narratives and makes it much easier to support reporting from commentary. And finally, make quality control routine. Run a quick CMA style pre-release check, publish transcripts where possible, and have a clear corrections policy. Over time, those habits compound trust and strengthen the credibility of a show. So, overall, this study finds that podcasts are not fully replacing legacy media, but they are meaningfully rebalancing how Canadians learn about, interpret, and discuss current events. Canada's media landscape is shifting in real time, and podcasts are one of the levers. In that shift, the most influential shows will treat accuracy as a feature and not as an afterthought. To quote the president of the Golden Globes, who just introduced a podcast category to their global awards show last week, podcasts have emerged as a profound medium, sharing narratives and building communities. So, I think to understand where we are headed next, it may be less about what we read and more about what we learn to listen for. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. So before I end, I want to say a few thank yous. So of course, my supervisor, Dave, appreciate you supporting me throughout this process. We had a lot of fun with it. I'd also like to say thank you to Martin for being my second reader and of course, sharing some very kind thoughts about my research. To Alex, my MCM cohort, the rest of the professors for the last 2 years of learnings. And then, of course, last but not least, big shout out to my whole family, my fiance, my parents, my brothers, my friends, just everyone who's been so supportive in getting me to the finish line. So I'm very glad to have all of you in my corner. And that is it. So I will close things out and I guess open the floor for questions. So, thank you.
Thank thank you very much, Marilena, for a fascinating tour through the world of podcasts, and very interesting results. I open the floor to your capstone supervisor, Professor Scholz, to start the questions off.
Thanks, Alex. Marilena, excellent presentation, excellent paper, well done. I'm going to ask you a method question, which is probably not a surprise. You talked about where you selected your podcasts from, were the top rankings of Canadian podcasts. But can you talk a little bit more about that? Plus, how did you select the events for this to just that you didn't sort of preset your bias to get through this? How did you control for that?
Yeah, definitely. So I kind of just used a filtering system. So as I said, I looked at Apple Podcast charts. So I went directly to news and current affairs, and they have about 100 that they're listed there. And then from there, I identified which ones were Canadian because I wanted to focus on our country specifically, and there's just tons that are global. And then from there, I filtered it even further by identifying what their media affiliation was. So I wanted to have a pretty good mix of the independent shows, the network shows, and then the radio show as well. And then from there, I wanted to look at if they could go back far enough. So because I was looking to have a longitudinal analysis starting in 2022, they needed to be producing episodes from that year consistently 2022, 2023, 2024, 2025. So some of them have just started in the last year or so. Obviously, podcasts are becoming very popular. So people are starting shows all over the place. So those were immediately removed from the sample. And then some shows even take a break and they, didn't produce anything in 2023, so it wouldn't have worked. So once I looked at it that way, the sample sort of wrote itself. I also removed any shows that I particularly listened to, so I didn't have that bias included. So that's how I picked the actual shows. And then in terms of the topics, sort of a similar process, I guess. So I looked at each individual year at a high level and sort of big events that happened in our country as news events. And I wanted to have a pretty good diversification of the types of topics. So we had the Queen Elizabeth story, which is more cultural, the TikTok ban, which is based on tech, the wildfires, which is environmental, and then, of course, the federal election results, which is political. So obviously, you can sort of hone in on one of those topics. I could have done all political stories, but I thought it would make for a bit more of an interesting paper based on that. And I think it really allowed me to build out the results based on not just the media affiliation, but also the types of topics and how that plays into things. So,
excellent. Thank you. Over to you, Martin.
Great, thank you. And Marilena, again, congratulations. Excellent research and a really compelling presentation too. You did a great job bringing your research to life in a way that isn't only understanding it, kind of, well, at least for me, got all sorts of light bulbs going off in my head. I also loved the credibility misinformation alignment index that you created because it's such an innovative way to measure the trust we get from media. And I thought, wow, that could maybe even replace MRP for anyone who knows MRP. Seriously, down the line, because communicators are going to be pitching or interacting with more and more podcasts. I wanted to ask you a speculative question because I thought it was really interesting how the results, showed where the Canadian market is. What do you think would have happened if you had done this south of the border? How do you think the results might have differed?
yeah, I think it would have been a bit more of a beast, to be honest. I actually did consider including some American podcasts specifically because they even report on Canadian news sometimes. And I think that that adds to a whole other level of misinformation because their perspective on what's happening here is so out of this world, right? Like it's completely different. So I think that it would have changed drastically because a lot of the types of shows that are reporting on news aren't necessarily in the news category. And I'll use this as an example because I mentioned that the Golden Globes last week introduced a podcast category for the very first time. And while it's an entertainment show and most of these are just, interviewing celebrities and whatnot, one of the shows that was nominated was actually one of the shows that Kamala Harris used in her 2024 election campaign. So when you think about that, the intersection of how an entertainment podcast and a political campaign are together, it really makes for a very interesting study. And it kind of goes off the beaten path and maybe was completely out of scope for what I was looking at. But I think in a way it would have had to be way larger because there's just so many facets of it, in the way that they discuss news and how they choose to go about it. So
Great, thank you.
I will take the prerogative of the chair to ask a question. I was interested in the results where they differentiated by audience and by topic. And so again, I think it's asking you to speculate a little bit, but what do you think your model says about how different types of information, like news information versus entertainment, or you mentioned opinion versus celebrity or whatever. How do you think? What does the model say about how people are going to podcasts for different types of information?
yeah, for sure. I think one of the key takeaways is just that it really does depend on the topic. I think in terms of how much importance you put on what credibility looks like. Um, Dave and I kind of discussed what the CMA index would look like for other types of podcasts. And I don't necessarily think that it works for the masses because there are so many different genres of podcasts. And, if you're listening to a pop culture podcast, you don't necessarily need it to be credible because you're listening to it for entertainment value or just, out of curiosity. They probably are spreading misinformation because there's no right answers about those sorts of topics. So the CMA is specifically designed for professional communicators, but really to understand what the news and podcast world looks like. But I think when it comes to topics specifically, again, like I said, when the facts are settled, there's just less room for speculation. So it's a bit safer to listen to really any type of podcast. But when there's really no understanding of of what's going to happen and people start putting their own spin on it, it becomes a little bit more into the misinformation risk area. So the podcast that I selected for the Canadian election was actually all episodes that were about the results. So they were after shows, right? And at that point, we knew Mark Carney was our new prime minister. They were basically just reporting on it as fact versus the lead up to it when obviously things were very up in the air and no one knew what was going to happen. So I think that actually would have been a really interesting comparator as well. And another area of study that can be done, sort of the before and after of how people's tone and input changes based on when facts are settled versus when, there's a lot of speculation and uncertainty about what the future is going to look like.
Thanks. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Dave.
Yeah. So I have so many questions, as you know, but I'm gonna go back to and Martin, thank you. Anything to replace MRPs, I'm all for.
Right.
So let's say the MCA starts to take off, and conceivably you could even use it to evaluate traditional media,
Mhm. Yeah.
not just podcasts, anything related to news. So I could apply an MCA score to the Sun Media Network, or I could apply it to the Globe and Mail or whatever it is. But let's just focus on news podcasts. Do you envision a day when I'm going to my Apple list to select a news podcast, and beside it there is an MCA score that'll help me to decide if this is a credible, less misinformation source? And if so, what needs to happen before we get there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, as I said, because I just think the world of podcasting is so large, I don't necessarily see it entering the world of, let's say, Apple Podcasts, although that would be very cool. But I do think a more maybe realistic next step for something like this in the world of communications is to maybe have it embedded into a platform that we already know and use, like a Cision or a Meltwater type of platform. So for those of you who aren't familiar, essentially it's a media monitoring tool where you can put in a theme or a keyword and it'll pull up all the news that they're talking about something. There's also journalism database and just ways to identify different media relations opportunities. I don't believe that there is a podcasting section yet, but I'm sure that's not very far off as it's becoming more and more part of communications strategies. So if we were able to sort of embed the AI CMA index into a tool like that, and for as a communicator to go in to sift through the opportunities and different podcasts that exist and have that score there, it really gives you a little bit of peace of mind, confidence going in, knowing that it's credible, or if they're not and there is a slight risk, why and what can they do about it to go in and prepare more going into it. So yeah, I guess big picture would be really cool to see it on Apple, but I think as a starting point, because it's really just it was intended for comms people, yeah, it would be great to see it on one of those types of platforms.
Excellent. Thank you. I'll hand it over to Martin.
Thank you, Dave. I want to talk about your observation about podcasts being able to be used for agenda setting. So I found that really interesting. And the whole notion of how when there are certain topics in the news, or maybe if enough podcasters talk about them, they become news or something that's being talked about. As someone who was a podcaster, an early one for like 15 years, I would constantly get pitched by PR people. And the pitches were like those spray and pray pitches, really. They weren't really relevant to me. How do you think communications people could use podcasts in a more strategic way for agenda setting?
Yeah, I think the agenda setting finding was quite unique because I picked big stories, right? So the podcast that I chose actually all covered these stories. I didn't actually use that as a filtering method when I was selecting them. They all did cover them and they were big stories. So I feel like it would have been a miss had they not. But what I learned is that the real value from these podcasts comes from the in-between stories, right? A huge finding from the survey was that people are turning to podcasts because they're covering stories or going more in depth on something they want to know more about, where these big newsrooms maybe don't have the time to sit down and research the facts and get that information out there. So I think it's in those kind of in-between stories that the real value of a podcast comes through. And I think that as someone in the communication space, pitching those, you want to highlight the value to the podcast of why this is something that people should know about and why you need that format to do it. I think that's one of the biggest sort of benefits of a podcast is it's sort of bringing back that humanizing conversation, just connection with people. Going into it, you don't necessarily have all of the questions prepared. It's sort of a natural evolution. It's just a conversation, right? So a lot of people shy away from that. I know a lot of leaders in certain organizations, they like to have a regimented process and they know exactly what they're going to be asked and exactly how they're going to answer. But podcasts aren't really like that, right? They sort of flow and depending on the direction that they go, right? So I think the ability to have that natural conversation and be open to talking about things in a bit more of a casual environment is really what the key thing to think about is moving forward.
Thank you.
So I had another question. This kind of was in the back of my mind throughout reading your paper. And it's this, it's like now that news programs, radio programs, everyone is putting up segments of their programs onto, Apple News or YouTube or whatever. What distinguishes, say, the at issue panel coming out, on YouTube for 21 minutes, hosted by Rosemary Barton, um, and featuring Canadian journalists from a podcast.
Yeah, I think that the actual definition of a podcast is sort of growing. It was at one point just an audio format, but as you said, people are now posting it on YouTube. They're filming themselves speaking. And while that actually does make it a what media richness theory calls a richer medium because there's more than one way to experience it, which is not necessarily a bad thing. I think that people have the option of how they would like to interact with the podcast, whether that's viewing it, whether that's listening to it in their car. There's different options. But with that does come a whole other slew of sort of issues. And again, it was a bit out of scope, but stuff that came in while I was doing this research is just now with the inclusion of so much video in podcasts, most of these podcasts are doing it specifically so they have sort of a promotional tool so they can clip the video, post it to social media, and that acts as promotion for the podcast versus, just putting an image with audio running in the background. It's not quite as engaging on a social platform. So they're starting to do that, but they're losing sight of the fact that podcasting was initially supposed to be an audio experience. So they're sort of running into issues now where, they're expecting everyone to be watching it. So they're not describing things in the same way you would when you think someone's only listening. A good example would be if you say, oh, it was this big, but if you're listening to that, you don't know what they mean, right? So you have to say, it's as big as whatever, an elephant or something, right? So having those audio descriptors is really what made a podcast unique in the past. But now that we're sort of finding this gray line between video and audio, I think that podcasters have to be very aware of that, and good podcasters are. But it's just interesting how we don't even have a real definition for it anymore because everyone's making a podcast. Interestingly, I also saw on Netflix yesterday that they have a podcast category there, and it's essentially just a show that you can watch where they're talking. So, is it a TV show? Is it a video? Is it audio? I don't know. But it's definitely blurring the lines. So,
Yeah, I saw that too. That it's interesting. It's this whole sort of um, social sharing makes all media hybrid, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, folks, are there any further questions from the panel? From Dave, Professor Scholz, or Professor Waxman? No? Are there any questions from the gallery or comments?
I have one comment. I think you should take this on the road and submit seriously to CPRS, to IABC, to different conferences.
I
Do
think you should do a
guest talks.
podcast.
Yeah, do a podcast. Yeah, the CMA podcast.
Yeah.
All right. I'll take that into consideration.
Well, that's actually what I was going to end with, because we do have a couple minutes before we go to deliberation. What are you going to do with it next?
Yeah, so I mean, I am committed to sharing the results on LinkedIn. I've had a lot of inquiries about this, so it's nice to see that there's so much interest surrounding it. But generally, I think that this sort of study is moving so quickly. I mean, I started this 6 months ago. I bet in 6 months it's going to look very differently. So I think just continuing to see where sort of the world of podcasting goes and keeping my eye on it. It's really just something I'm personally interested in, but it also supports me in my professional life. And then yeah, I mean, who knows? I'm open to other opportunities. So if Martin says that I can go on the road with this, then maybe that's the next step too.
I think you can definitely present it at conferences, and I think you should try to publish a version of it somewhere, because it's a thoughtful index, and as Dave mentioned, it captures something. And I think anytime we can share a metric that has been thoroughly researched and thought through the way you have done in this work, we should, with the community, because God knows you don't have enough metrics.
Yeah, I'm just gonna suggest though that we refer to it as the MCM CMA, just to get the branding in there.
Got it.
But if you're interested, we can talk about where you might publish it and how you would have to publish and whatnot.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Okay, so let's shall we I have to
stop recording and then move everyone to a room, right?
Yes, that's right.